Alright, so we're going to be talking about ecological concepts, including trophic levels and energy transfer in those ecosystems. So let's start off with an ecological pyramid, which is looking at how energy moves through the ecosystem as it goes up through different trophic levels. On average, approximately 10% of the energy that is acquired in one trophic level is available to the next one. And so if you look at the energy of the producers, and all of that energy there is coming from the sun in the form of photosynthesis. So if we start off with 100% of the available energy in an ecosystem, once those plants are consumed by the primary consumers, the herbivores, only about 10% of the energy of the plants is found in those herbivores. When we get to the secondary consumers or your predators, only 10% of that energy is able to move its way up, and so you've only got 1% of the available energy. When you look at the predators of those predators, the tertiary consumers, again, only 10% of the energy can move up to the next level. So what this means is because we're losing so much energy at each trophic level, the number of organisms who can live at that trophic level is greatly reduced at each level. A couple of things to think about that people get confused quite a bit. First of all, energy flows. Energy cannot be recycled or reused. It flows into an ecosystem and it leaves the ecosystem. So it flows into the ecosystem in the form of light, and plants take it up, and through photosynthesis, it becomes stored as chemical energy, and then it moves through the trophic levels. But all of the energy eventually will leave that ecosystem, and it will leave it in as heat. Eventually, if you keep going 10%, 10%, 10%, you get to a point where there's virtually no energy left, and that's the end of the trophic levels. So energy must always re-enter the ecosystem in the form of light from the sun. On the other hand, matter cycles. It goes through a cycle in which it cannot be destroyed. It's recycled within those ecosystems. And so what you see here is that carbon is taken up through photosynthesis. It then moves its way through the trophic levels, and that carbon is always returned back into the environment in the form of carbon dioxide in respiration. And then those same carbon atoms are recycled again as they're taken back up by the plants through photosynthesis. So energy flows, matter cycles. Again, I've pointed out that generally only about 10% of the available chemical energy can be transferred to the next trophic level. So when you look at a trophic pyramid, you're always going to see dramatically smaller numbers of organisms at each trophic level. So let's take a look at a specific example. Let's take a look at an ocean environment. So let's say we're looking at our producers, and there are 10,000 energy units that have been taken up by the photosynthetic algae, the phytoplankton in the ocean. Of those 10,000 energy units, only 1,000, or 10% of that, are now found in the zooplankton and tiny filter feeders that feed on that phytoplankton. As we look at the next trophic level, those secondary consumers, the small fish and predators that feed on these phytoplankton and zooplankton, only about 100 energy units are now available at that trophic level. When we look at the larger predators, the large fish, the squid, the seals, again, only 10% can move up, so we've got 10 energy units. Then when we talk about our highest trophic levels, like our fourth level consumers, our sharks, our eagles, killer whales, there's only one energy unit left from the original 10,000 units. That's why there are billions and billions of plankton in the ocean. There are millions of fish, but there may only be a small number of killer whales. Along the way, we've got a group of organisms who are basically found at multiple trophic levels because they are feeding on dead and decaying materials. So we're going to talk about detritivores and scavengers. Detritivores are organisms that feed on decaying matter. These include many insects and crustaceans and worms, and all of these organisms are going to feed on this dead and decaying material, and they're going to recycle that matter into their own bodies and then return it back into the ecosystem and make it available for other organisms. Scavengers basically are very similar to detritivores, except they feed primarily on freshly dead material such as, these vultures feeding on this dead mammal here, um, and they're going to pick up this fallen material, the fruits, the seeds, the leaves, the freshly dead animals. They're going to feed on that and then return those nutrients back into the ecosystem. Another group of organisms are known as the decomposers, and these are organisms that can break down organic material directly through biochemical processes. They don't eat the food the same way that detritivores and scavengers do. Rather, they typically will secrete chemicals that break down the material, and then they're able to absorb the nutrients that are freed up through those chemical reactions directly into their bodies. So we're looking at organisms such as fungi, mold, mushrooms, and bacteria as well. So these are organisms that break down organic material directly and free up the nutrients to be taken up by the next trophic level. So as we look at our trophic levels, a lot of times we'll talk about a food chain where things are just going from one organism to another, a plant to a deer to a cougar. But in reality, ecosystems look like food webs, where there's a variety of organisms that are feeding at different trophic levels. So, a mouse is able to feed on both plant material and animals at the same time, and so they can be at multiple trophic levels simultaneously. This was a quote that I saw one place that I thought was kind of interesting. It reads that 300 trout are needed to support one man for a year. However, in order to produce those 300 trout, they may have to consume up to 90,000 frogs to get the energy that they need. And those 90,000 frogs may have to consume 27 million grasshoppers. And those 27 million grasshoppers are living off of 1,000 tons of grass. So if you kind of then talk about it from the base level, the primary producers, to the highest level, in this case the man, it will take 1,000 acres of grass or hay to feed a single man. Okay, so let's see what you've gotten out of this presentation. So here's a diagram showing the different trophic levels in both a terrestrial and an aquatic environment. How many trophic levels are shown? Okay, so as you look at this, you can definitely see that there are 5 trophic levels. What are the primary producers for both the land and the sea? Well, for the land environment, we're talking about the plant. That's the one doing photosynthesis and is the base of the food chain. And for the sea, we're talking about phytoplankton, marine algae that are doing photosynthesis in the ocean. As we look at the difference between trophic levels 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the consumers, one of the biggest things that you should notice is that the organisms are getting larger and there are fewer of them because there's less available energy. You have to be larger if you're going to try to prey on something. You have to be bigger than it typically to feed on it. And second of all, there are going to be far fewer of them. So, what important ecological role is missing from this diagram? Well, what's missing from this is the detritivores and decomposers. And realizing that every single organism, all the way up at every trophic level, is eventually going to die, those detritivores, scavengers, and decomposers actually exist at every single trophic level. Okay, one more question about this, or one more series of questions. Let's take a look at this food web from the Antarctic pelagic community. Name the primary producers. All right, in this case, it's the phytoplankton. What transforms a food chain into a food web? Well, the answer to that is that organisms are feeding at multiple trophic levels and feed on more than one thing at a time. Name a primary consumer. In this case, the primary consumers are your herbivorous plankton and your krill. because they're feeding on the phytoplankton. Name a secondary consumer. Well, there's a lot of those because it's anything that feeds on the herbivorous plankton or the krill. So we're talking about everything from the whale to the crab-eater seal, the birds, the fish, the squids, the carnivorous plankton, and so forth. What is the trend in the size of the organisms as you move up the trophic levels? In general, the higher up you go, the larger those organisms become. Now, I told you that most trophic levels transfer approximately 10% of the energy into biomass for the next trophic level. And that is generally true, but there is a variation depending on the specific organism that you're looking at and how efficient they are at moving energy. Humans are a little bit on the lower end, maybe about 8%. Other organisms maybe a little bit higher. The organisms that have the highest energy efficiency of transferring energy from the food that they eat into their living tissue are insects, who are able to transfer up to 35% of the food they eat into living tissue. That's why insects were able to reproduce so rapidly and grow in population just over the summer. That's why when people are looking at what is the most efficient way to move energy from one trophic level to another on the smallest landmass possible, when we look at things like how can we feed billions of humans on a small area of available land, what we're finding is that actually insects would be the way to do it because they're far more energy efficient and can produce more biomass in a smaller area than organisms we typically eat, such as cattle. So eating lower on the food chain in general results in needing less land to feed the people. So as we look at this diagram here, you're going to see that this is the number of people that can be fed on 2.5 acres of land. So if we had 2.5 acres of land, we could feed one person if we were trying to grow beef on that land, one person if we were trying to do eggs, up to 15 people if we used that land to produce wheat. And as you can see here that potatoes allow you to feed up to 22 people on the same plot of land. So the lower down on the food chain you get, the more people you can feed. You'll also notice that these numbers for the plants tend to be 10 times or more higher than for the animal products. You can also see this diagram over on the left showing the gallons of water necessary to produce a pound of food. So to produce a pound of meat requires you to use 5,000 gallons of water for beef, or 1,600 for pork, or 800 for chicken. But if you want to produce a pound of various fruits and vegetables, you see that you only need between 20 and 50 gallons of water. So again, the lower down the food chain you get, the more efficient it is in terms of water usage. Okay, so primary productivity is looking at the amount of biomass produced in an ecosystem in a year, basically looking at the total amount of photosynthesis that is directly converted into plant material, including its leaves and wood and so forth. Then secondary productivity is looking not just at the photosynthesis, but all of the living organisms that live in that ecosystem. So we're talking about everything, including the fungus that lives in the soil and the bacteria and the herbivores that live there that are feeding on that plant material, and even the carnivores. Here's a map showing productivity around the world. Looking at the land, what you'll notice is that the dark green areas have extremely high productivity on land, and the yellowish areas have very low productivity. What's a trend that you notice on this? Well, one thing you should probably notice is that the yellow areas are your desert areas, okay? So water is a critical limiting factor in productivity. In addition, productivity tends to decrease as you move into colder and polar regions, high mountain areas, and up in the Arctic, because of course the growing seasons are a lot shorter. The highest productivity in the world occurs in your tropical rainforests of the Amazon, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. There's also high productivity in the wet areas of your temperate forests of the eastern United States and in your boreal forests. Now, as you look at the ocean, one thing you'll notice is that productivity is actually highest near the North Pole and down along the edge of Antarctica, and it's actually lowest and right in the middle of the oceans. And we'll get into some of the reasons for why that is later. Yes, I'm here. Sorry for messing it up. It's actually looks like that cattle may actually out compete krill for the title of the largest amount of world. So we humans have basically allowed cattle to become the world's most dominant organism. If we were to weigh all the fish of the ocean, it's estimated that there's probably somewhere between 800 million and 2 billion tons of fish. And about 25% of the world's biomass is thought to be contained in fungi. All right, finally, let's take a look at productivity of different ecosystems. The most productive ecosystem on the planet are actually your swamps and marshes. These swamps and marshes are extremely productive, producing over 2,500 grams per meter squared per year. So here's a marsh area. It's going to produce a lot of biomass, especially in the warm summer seasons. Tropical rainforests come in pretty close behind at about 2,000 grams per meter squared per year. So they are one of the most productive, they are the most productive terrestrial ecosystems. Coral reefs and algae beds, such as your kelp forests, also come in at about 2,000, so they're also extremely productive. Our temperate forests that are cooler and have a shorter growing season than a tropical rainforest only produce about half or a little over half the biomass that a tropical rainforest does, at about 1,250. When you look at our agricultural fields, they only come in at about half the rate of a temperate forest. So when you cut down a temperate forest and replace it with an agricultural field, you're actually cutting the total biomass production in half. And then the last one I'll show you on here is deserts have extremely low biomass because, of course, it's too dry to be able to grow anything. So that's it. We've talked about the movement of energy across the different trophic levels, and we've talked a little bit about food chains and food webs as well as primary productivity.